In the quiet village of Chipping Norton, a chilling mystery unfolds, as wealthy widower Reginald Hawthorne is found dead beside his gramophone, its haunting melody still playing. Was it his heart, or something sinister? Miss Jane Marple, with her sharp eyes and gentle demeanour, unravels a web of secrets, love, betrayal and greed among a cast of suspects. A defiant niece, a bitter businessman, and a former actress with a hidden past. A crimson lipstick smudge and a tampered brandy glass hold the key, but time is ticking. Can Miss Marple solve the murder before the music stops? Chapter 1. The quiet village of Chipping Norton. The village of Chipping Norton drowsed under the pale October sun, its thatched cottages and winding lanes bathed in the soft gold of autumn. The air carried the scent of wood smoke and damp earth, and the distant chime of the church clock marked the unhurried rhythm of life. In her neat cottage on Willow Lane, Miss Jane Marple sat by the window, her fingers deftly working a pair of knitting needles. A half-finished shawl, soft as a cloud, spilled across her lap. Her eyes, bright and bird-like, flickered occasionally to the garden, where her roses clung stubbornly to their final blooms. Miss Marple had lived in Chipping Norton for many years, and though she seldom left her cottage, little escaped her notice. The villagers, with their predictable habits and small vanities, were an open book to her. She knew, for instance, that Mrs. Carter, the baker's wife, was feuding with the butcher over a misdelivered parcel, and that young Dr. Haydock's new motor car was the talk of the tea shop. Such observations, trivial to some, were to Miss Marple the threads of a tapestry, revealing the patterns of human nature. On this particular morning, as she sipped her Earl Grey and contemplated a knotty stitch, a flurry of movement caught her eye. Mrs. Hattie Green, the postmistress, was hurrying down the lane, her coat flapping and her round face pink with exertion. She paused at Miss Marple's gate, clutching the picket fence to steady herself. "Oh, Miss Marple," she called, her voice sharp with excitement. "Such a dreadful thing has happened. Mr. Hawthorne, up at the Grange, he's dead, found this very morning, beside his gramophone." Miss Marple's needles paused and she looked up, her expression one of polite surprise, though her mind was already turning. "Dear me, Hattie, how shocking! Do come in and tell me everything." Mrs. Green needed no further invitation. She bustled into the cottage, settling into a chintz-covered chair with a sigh. "It's dreadful, truly," she began, smoothing her skirt. "Mrs. Dobbs, his housekeeper, found him at 7 o'clock. He was in the drawing-room, slumped in his chair. And that gramophone of his was still playing. Some mournful tune, she said. Dr. Haydock was called at once, and he says it's not natural causes. The police are there now, and they've sent for Inspector Craddock from Scotland Yard." Miss Marple tilted her head, her pale blue eyes thoughtful. "Not natural causes," she repeated softly. "And the gramophone playing. How very peculiar. Was Mr. Hawthorne alone last night?" Mrs. Green nodded vigorously. "So Mrs. Dobbs says. He was a solitary sort, you know, ever since his wife passed. Kept to himself mostly, though he had those guests last week, his niece, that actress woman, and the businessman. But last night, it was just him and the staff." Miss Marple set her knitting aside and poured her guest a cup of tea. "Tell me, Hattie, what do we know of Mr. Hawthorne? He was rather new to Chipping Norton, was he not?" "Oh, yes," said Mrs. Green, warming to her task. "He came 2 years ago, after retiring from his solicitor's practice in London. a quiet man, but sharp, they say. Made a fortune, though you wouldn't know it from his manner. Lived simply, except for that gramophone. He was mad for music, always playing those old records. Some in the village thought him standoffish, but I reckon he was just private." Miss Marple nodded, her mind drifting to a memory of her nephew Raymond, who had once described a solicitor in London whose reserved demeanour hid a tangle of secrets. "And his guests," she prompted. Mrs. Green leaned forward, lowering her voice. "There's Clara, his niece, a pretty young thing, always laughing but a bit flighty. Then Mr. Price, a grim sort of man, something to do with investments, I hear. And Miss Trent, who used to be on the stage. She's older now, but my, she's still got a way about her. They stayed at the Grange for a weekend, but that was days ago." Miss Marple's fingers resumed their knitting, the needles clicking rhythmically. "A gramophone playing," she murmured, almost to herself, "and a man dead beside it. It does make one wonder, doesn't it?" Mrs. Green, accustomed to Miss Marple's cryptic remarks, took another sip of tea. "Wonder what, Miss Marple?" "Oh, nothing definite," she replied with a small smile. "Only that music, like people, can sometimes tell us more than it seems." As Mrs. Green chattered on, recounting the village's shock and speculation, Miss Marple's thoughts were elsewhere. She pictured the Grange, its grand rooms and silent corridors, and Mr. Hawthorne, alone with his music until death had joined him. Something in the scene, she felt, was not quite right. It was like a mislaid stitch in her knitting. Small, easily overlooked, but enough to unravel the whole pattern if you tugged at it. By the time Mrs. Green took her leave, promising to report any further news, Miss Marple had resolved to visit the Grange herself. She donned her best hat, a sensible black felt with a single feather, and set out, her step brisk despite her years. The village might be quiet, but beneath its calm surface she sensed a current of unease. And Miss Marple, with her unerring instinct for such things, knew that a gramophone, however melodious, could not drown out the truth. Chapter 2. The Scene at the Grange. The autumn sun hung low over Chipping Norton, casting long shadows across the gravel drive of the Grange as Miss Jane Marple approached. The manor stood imposing yet elegant, its ivy-clad walls and tall chimneys speaking of wealth tempered by restraint. Miss Marple, her black lace mittens tucked neatly into her handbag, paused at the wrought-iron gate to survey the scene. A constable stood guard, his youthful face set in an attempt at solemnity, while a small knot of villagers lingered nearby, whispering speculations. She nodded politely to them, her serene expression giving no hint of the keen curiosity that stirred within. Inspector Craddock, a man whose courteous demeanour belied a sharp mind, greeted her at the door. "Miss Marple, I'm glad you've come," he said, his voice low. "This is a queer business, and I'd value your thoughts. The doctor's certain it's not a natural death, though we've no clear sign of violence." Miss Marple inclined her head, her pale blue eyes flickering with interest. "How very disturbing, Inspector. May I see where it happened?" He led her through the oak-panelled hall, where portraits of stern-faced ancestors gazed down, to the drawing-room. The room was a study in opulence. Heavy velvet curtains framed tall windows, a crystal chandelier gleamed faintly in the daylight, and a mahogany sideboard held an array of decanters. At the centre stood a plush armchair, and beside it the gramophone, a handsome contraption of polished wood and brass. its horn gleaming faintly. Mr. Reginald Hawthorne lay slumped in the chair, his head tilted back, his face pale but composed, as though he had merely drifted into a restful sleep. The gramophone's needle scratched softly, the record having spun to its silent end. Miss Marple's gaze darted about, taking in every detail. A half-empty glass of brandy sat on a small table beside the chair, its amber contents catching the light. Nearby, a bottle of pills, heart medication by the label, stood uncapped. An ashtray lay overturned on the rug, its contents spilling across the intricate pattern. A book of poetry, its pages splayed open, rested on the floor as if dropped in haste. Most curious of all was a faint smudge of red on the gramophone's horn, barely noticeable against the brass. "Extraordinary," Miss Marple murmured, stepping closer. She adjusted her spectacles and peered at the smudge. Lipstick, perhaps? Inspector Craddock frowned, following her gaze. Possibly, but it's an odd shade. Bright red, almost theatrical. Mrs. Dobbs, the housekeeper, doesn't wear makeup, and the maid, Ellen, swears she never touches the gramophone. Mr. Hawthorne's niece, Clara, prefers a lighter pink, and Miss Trent, the former actress, claims she gave up cosmetics years ago. Miss Marple's lips curved into a faint smile. Claims, Inspector, are like curtains. They may hide more than they reveal. She turned her attention to the brandy glass, noting its position. "Was this tested?" she asked. "Not yet," Craddock replied. "The doctor took samples, but we're waiting on the laboratory. The pills are digitalis, prescribed for his heart condition. Nothing unusual there, though the bottle's label is slightly askew, as if it's been handled roughly." Miss Marple nodded, her mind already weaving connections. She recalled a case in her youth, in St. Mary Mead, where a tampered bottle had been the key to a poisoning. "And the room was locked, you say?" "Yes," Craddock confirmed. "Mrs. Dobbs found him at 7 this morning. The doors were bolted from the inside and the windows were latched. No sign of forced entry." "Locked rooms," Miss Marple said softly, "are often less impenetrable than they appear. People, after all, have their ways." Craddock led her to the gramophone, explaining that it had been playing a Schubert sonata when Mrs. Dobbs entered. "She said it was one of his favourites," he added. "The record lasts about 30 minutes. If it was still playing when she found him, he couldn't have been dead long." Miss Marple tilted her head, considering. 30 minutes, she repeated. "That is precise, isn't it? Almost too precise." She glanced at the book of poetry. Keats, she noted, open to Ode to a Nightingale. The page was creased, as if it had been read repeatedly. "Did Mr. Hawthorne often read poetry while listening to music?" "Mrs. Dobbs says he did," Craddock replied. "He was a cultured man, though solitary. Spent most evenings here, with his gramophone and books." Miss Marple moved to the window, her small, neat figure framed against the fading light. The lawn outside was pristine, no footprints marring the dew-damp grass. Yet something about the scene nagged at her, a sense of staging, as if the room had been arranged to tell a story. She thought of her neighbour, Mrs. Price, who once staged a fainting spell to divert attention from a stolen brooch. People, she mused aloud, are so very good at distraction. Craddock raised an eyebrow. "You think this was staged?" "I think," she said carefully, "that nothing in this room is quite what it seems. The gramophone, the brandy, the book, they are like props in a play. And plays, Inspector, always have a director." They were interrupted by Mrs. Dobbs, a stout woman with a nervous air, who entered to offer tea. Her hands trembled slightly as she set the tray down, and Miss Marple noted the faint redness around her eyes. "A terrible shock, ma'am," Mrs. Dobbs said, her voice quavering. "Mr. Hawthorne was a good master, never a cross word. Who'd want to harm him?" "Indeed," Miss Marple replied kindly. "It must be very distressing. Tell me, Mrs. Dobbs, did Mr. Hawthorne have any visitors yesterday evening?" "None, ma'am," she said firmly. "He dined alone as usual, then retired here. I locked up at 8 as he liked and went to my room. Ellen and Tom were in their quarters too." "And you heard nothing unusual?" Miss Marple pressed, her tone gentle but probing. Mrs. Dobbs hesitated, twisting her apron. "Well, I thought I heard the gramophone later than usual, past 10 maybe, but Mr. Hawthorne sometimes played it late, so I didn't think much of it." Miss Marple thanked her, her mind noting the detail. As Mrs. Dobbs left, Craddock turned to her. "What are you thinking, Miss Marple?" She adjusted her shawl, her eyes distant. "I'm thinking of a young woman I once knew, in another village, who played a gramophone to drown out a conversation she didn't want overheard. Music, you see, can be a most effective screen." Craddock looked puzzled but nodded. "We'll question the staff again and look into those guests. Clara Hawthorne, Leonard Price, and Sylvia Trent. They were here last week, and there's talk of tensions. Clara's set to inherit. Price had business disputes with Hawthorne, and Miss Trent, well, there's history there from years ago." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. "History, Inspector, has a way of lingering, like a tune you can't forget." She glanced once more at the gramophone, its silent horn seeming to mock the stillness of the room. "We must listen carefully," she said, "for the truth is often hidden in the notes we overlook." As they left the drawing room, the constable outside tipped his hat, and the villagers' whispers grew hushed. Miss Marple, her step light despite the gravity of the scene, felt a familiar thrill. The Grange, with its locked doors and silent clues, was a puzzle waiting to be solved. And she, with her quiet ways and sharp mind, was already tracing its edges. Chapter 3. The Household and the Guests. The afternoon light filtered through the lace curtains of the vicarage, casting delicate patterns on the worn oak table, where Miss Jane Marple sat with a cup of tea. The vicar's wife, Mrs. Laura Clement, a kind but slightly flustered woman, poured another cup, her hands betraying a nervous energy. "It's simply dreadful, Miss Marple," she said, her voice hushed. "Mr. Hawthorne dead, and in such a mysterious way. The village is all abuzz. Some say it's murder, others think it's his heart. What do you make of it?" Miss Marple's eyes, bright and perceptive behind her spectacles, met Mrs. Clement's with a gentle smile. "People will talk, Laura, and often they say more than they mean to. I find it best to listen and piece things together like a quilt. Each scrap tells a story." Mrs. Clement nodded, though her brow furrowed. "But who could have done it? Mr. Hawthorne was such a private man. Surely no one in Chipping Norton would—" "Oh, my dear," Miss Marple interrupted softly, "human nature is much the same everywhere, whether in Chipping Norton or farther afield. Now tell me about these guests who visited the Grange last week. I hear there were 3. Mrs. Clement, eager to share what she knew, leaned forward. "Yes, there was Clara Hawthorne, his niece, a lively girl, always full of chatter, though some say she's headstrong. Then Mr. Leonard Price, a businessman from London, very dour. always talking of stocks and shares. And Miss Sylvia Trent, who was once quite famous on the stage, you know. She's older now, but still carries herself like a queen. They stayed for a weekend, but I heard there were arguments, something about money and old promises. Miss Marple sipped her tea, her mind turning over the names. Arguments, you say? That is interesting. And what of the household at the Grange? Oh, it's a small staff, Mrs. Clement replied. Mrs. Dobbs, the housekeeper, has been there for years, very loyal but a bit nervy. Then there's Ellen, the maid, a shy girl, always blushing, and Tom, the gardener, a strong lad but not overly bright. They all seemed fond of Mr. Hawthorne, though I suppose one never knows. Miss Marple set her cup down, her fingers smoothing the edge of her shawl. Fondness, she mused, can sometimes mask other feelings. I recall a case in my old village where a devoted servant harboured quite a grudge over a slight no one else noticed. People are such complex creatures. Leaving the vicarage, Miss Marple walked slowly through Chipping Norton, her black umbrella tapping the cobblestones. The village was stirring with gossip, and she caught fragments as she passed the tea shop and the butcher's. Clara's extravagant tastes, Mr. Price's failed investments, Miss Trent's dramatic airs. Each tidbit was a thread, and Miss Marple's mind was already weaving them into a pattern. At the post office, she paused to chat with Mrs. Green, who was sorting letters with a distracted air. "Miss Marple, have you heard?" Mrs. Green said, her eyes wide. "They're saying Mr. Hawthorne's will leaves everything to Clara, but only if she marries sensibly. And she's set her heart on that artist fellow, Peter Vane, who hasn't a penny." Miss Marple's eyebrows lifted slightly. "An artist, you say? How romantic! And did Mr. Hawthorne approve?" "Not a bit," Mrs. Green replied. "Tom, the gardener, told my nephew he overheard them arguing about it last week. Clara was in tears, shouting that her uncle didn't understand love." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. "Young people do feel things so deeply. And what of Mr. Price and Miss Trent? Were they part of these discussions?" Mrs. Green lowered her voice. "Mr. Price was cross about some business deal gone wrong, something about shares in a mining venture. He left the Grange in a temper, my nephew said. As for Miss Trent, she's a mystery. She was seen near the manor 2 nights ago, though she claims she was in London. Mrs. Carter swears she saw her by the lane, wearing a dark cloak. 2 nights ago," Miss Marple repeated, her tone mild but her mind alert. "How curious! People do turn up where they're least expected." As she made her way home, Miss Marple stopped by the churchyard, where the vicar, Mr. Clement, was tending to a rose bush. He greeted her warmly, his scholarly face crisped with concern. "A sad business, Miss Marple. I visited Mr. Hawthorne last month, and he seemed in good spirits, though preoccupied. He spoke of regrets. Old promises unkept, he said. I wonder if it weighed on him." "Regrets," Miss Marple said softly, "can be heavy burdens. Did he mention anyone in particular?" The vicar hesitated. He spoke of a woman from his past, someone he'd wronged. I assumed he meant Miss Trent, given their history. They were engaged once, you know, years ago, but it ended badly. Miss Marple's eyes gleamed with interest. "An old engagement! How very illuminating! Old wounds, Mr. Clement, have a way of festering." Back at her cottage, Miss Marple settled by the fire, her cat Tuppence curling at her feet. She took up her knitting, the needles clicking rhythmically as her thoughts raced. Clara, with her inheritance tied to her uncle's approval, Price, nursing a financial grievance, Miss Trent with a past betrayal, all had reasons to resent Mr. Hawthorne. And the household, Mrs. Dobbs, Ellen Tom, might know more than they let on. She thought of a similar case years ago, where a quiet housemaid had overheard a fatal secret. Servants, she murmured to Tuppence, see so much, yet say so little. The gramophone puzzled her most. Why was it playing? Was it a habit, as Mrs. Dobbs claimed, or something more deliberate? She recalled a neighbour, Miss Fletcher, who used music to mask a clandestine meeting. Could the gramophone have served a similar purpose? To cover a sound, a movement, a presence? As dusk settled over Chipping Norton, Miss Marple lit a lamp and opened her notebook, jotting down names and motives. Clara's love for an artist, Price's failed venture, Miss Trent's broken heart, each was a piece of the puzzle. The staff too might hold clues. Mrs. Dobbs's nerves, Ellen's shyness, Tom's overheard arguments. And then there was the red smudge on the gramophone, a detail that felt both vital and elusive. She closed her notebook, her gaze drifting to the window. The village lay quiet, its lights twinkling in the gathering dark. But Miss Marple knew that beneath this calm, secrets stirred. The Grange, with its silent rooms and spinning records, held answers. And she, with her unassuming air and relentless curiosity, would find them, one thread at a time. Chapter 4. The Gramophone's Secret. The morning mist clung to the hedgerows of Chipping Norton as Miss Jane Marple made her way back to the Grange, her sensible shoes crunching softly on the gravel path. A brisk breeze carried the scent of fallen leaves, and she drew her shawl closer, her mind as sharp as the autumn air. The gramophone, with its mournful tune and curious red smudge, had lingered in her thoughts all night, like a melody that refused to fade. She felt certain it held a key to Mr. Hawthorne's death, though its precise role remained tantalizingly out of reach. Inspector Craddock met her at the manor's door, his face weary but welcoming. "You're up early, Miss Marple," he said, tipping his hat. "I hope you've some new insight. We're still waiting on the laboratory results for the brandy, but I've a feeling this case hinges on something we're missing." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled behind her spectacles. "Sometimes, Inspector, it's the smallest things that speak the loudest. I'd like to take another look at that gramophone, if I may." They crossed the hall, where the air was heavy with the scent of polish and old wood, and entered the drawing-room. The scene was much as it had been. Mr. Hawthorne's body had been removed, but the armchair, the brandy glass, and the gramophone remained, frozen in their silent tableau. The book of Keats lay closed on the table now, its creased pages smoothed by some careful hand. Miss Marple's gaze settled on the gramophone, its brass horn gleaming faintly in the morning light. She stepped closer, her small figure dwarfed by the room's grandeur, and examined the machine with care. The record, a rare pressing of Schubert's piano sonata in B-flat major, was still on the turntable, its surface unmarred by scratches. The needle rested at the end, caught in the final groove. The red smudge on the horn was clearer now, a vivid crimson, almost garish against the polished brass. "Lipstick, you thought?" Craddock said, following her gaze. "We've asked around, but no one admits to owning such a shade. Mrs. Dobbs is too practical for makeup. Ellen says she only uses a touch of powder, and Clara's fond of softer colours. Miss Trent insists she hasn't worn lipstick in years, not since her stage days." Miss Marple tilted her head, her expression thoughtful. "And yet, Inspector, here it is, Lipstick does not appear by magic. Someone touched this horn, perhaps in haste or carelessness." She paused, her fingers brushing the edge of the gramophone. "Tell me, was the record dusted for fingerprints?" Craddock nodded. "Yes, but it's a mess. Smudges mostly, likely from Mr. Hawthorne himself. The horn had a few partial prints, but nothing clear enough to identify." Miss Marple's lips pursed slightly. "How inconvenient," she murmured, though her tone suggested she was not entirely surprised. She bent closer, noting the gramophone's mechanism. A sturdy, well-maintained model, its crank handle polished from frequent use. "Mr. Hawthorne was fond of music, wasn't he? Did he often play this particular record?" "Mrs. Dobbs says it was one of his favourites," Craddock replied. "He'd play it most evenings, especially when he was alone. She thought it soothed him." Miss Marple straightened, her gaze drifting to the brandy glass. "Soothed him," she repeated softly, "or perhaps distracted him." She recalled a case from her youth, where a phonograph had been used to mask the sound of a window being forced open. Music, she knew, could serve many purposes beyond mere enjoyment. She turned her attention to the table, where the bottle of digitalis pills stood beside the glass. The label, she noted again, was slightly misaligned, as if it had been removed and reaffixed. "Have these been tested?" she asked. "Not yet," Craddock admitted. "The doctor says they're standard heart medication, but we've sent a sample to the laboratory. The bottle looks ordinary enough, though that label's odd, almost like it was tampered with." Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. "Tampered," she said quietly. "That is a word worth remembering." She thought of her old friend, Mrs. Eldridge, whose chemist husband had once uncovered a poisoning by noticing a bottle's seal had been broken. Small details, she knew, could unravel great crimes. Leaving the drawing room, Miss Marple asked to speak with Mrs. Dobbs. The housekeeper, her face pale and her hands twisting a handkerchief, met them in the kitchen. "It's a terrible thing, ma'am," she said, her voice trembling. "Mr. Hawthorne was a kind man, never a trouble to anyone. I can't think who'd do this." "Of course," Miss Marple said kindly. "It must be a great shock. Tell me, Mrs. Dobbs, did Mr. Hawthorne always take his pills with brandy?" Mrs. Dobbs hesitated, her eyes darting to Craddock. "Well, not always, ma'am. He'd take them with water usually, but he liked a glass of brandy in the evening. I saw the glass there last night when I brought his tea tray." "And the gramophone," Miss Marple continued, her tone gentle but insistent. "Did he play it every night?" "Most nights, yes," Mrs. Dobbs said. "He'd wind it up after dinner and sit with his books or papers. That Schubert one was special to him. He said it reminded him of his youth." Miss Marple nodded, filing the detail away. "And you heard it playing late, you said? Past 10? Mrs. Dobbs flushed. "Yes, ma'am, though I wasn't sure of the time. I was in my room and it's far from the drawing room. I thought it odd, but Mr. Hawthorne sometimes stayed up late." "Thank you, Mrs. Dobbs," Miss Marple said, her smile reassuring. As the housekeeper retreated, she turned to Craddock. "The timing is curious, don't you think? If the record was still playing at 7, and it lasts 30 minutes, the crime must have happened close to that hour. Yet Mrs. Dobbs heard music much earlier." Craddock rubbed his chin. "You're suggesting someone set the gramophone later, to make it seem he died in the morning?" "Or to cover something else," Miss Marple said. "Music Inspector can soon hide a multitude of sins. Back at her cottage, Miss Marple sat by her fire, her knitting untouched as she pondered. The gramophone's role was deliberate, she felt sure, not just a habit, but a tool. The lipstick smudge, too, was no accident. Someone had touched the horn, perhaps to start the record or adjust it. She thought of Clara, with her youthful defiance, Price, with his financial grudges, Miss Trent, with her shadowed past. And the staff, Mrs. Dobbs's nerves, Ellen's timidity, Tom's overheard arguments. Each might hold a piece of the truth. She opened a notebook, jotting down the facts. The gramophone, the lipstick, the tampered label. It's like a play, she murmured to her cat Tuppence. All the props are in place, but the script is hidden. She recalled a village scandal, where a seemingly trivial detail, a misplaced hairpin, had revealed a murderer. The gramophone, she suspected, was this case's hairpin, waiting to be noticed. As the fire crackled, Miss Marple's thoughts turned to the evening ahead. She would visit the chemist, Mr. Gibbs, to inquire about the digitalis prescription. And perhaps, she thought, a quiet word with Ellen might shed light on that curious smudge. The truth, she knew, was close, humming softly like a record about to play its final note. Chapter 5. A Village of Motives. The late afternoon sun cast a golden glow over Chipping Norton, softening the edges of the village's stone walls and thatched roofs. Miss Jane Marple sat in her cottage, her knitting needles idle in her lap as she gazed out at the quiet lane. The events at the Grange had stirred the village into a hum of speculation, and snippets of gossip reached her ears like leaves carried on the wind. Each whisper, each furtive glance added to the tapestry she was weaving in her mind, a tapestry of motives, secrets, and half-truths. Miss Marple's morning had been spent in discreet inquiries. At the chemist's shop, Mr. Gibbs, a meticulous man with a penchant for detail, confirmed that Mr. Hawthorne's digitalis prescription had been filled a fortnight ago. He was particular about it, Mr. Gibbs said, polishing his spectacles. Always checked the bottle himself. Odd, though. The last one I sent up had a label I'd printed fresh, but Mrs. Dobbs mentioned it looked worn when she saw it. Worn, you say? Miss Marple's voice was gentle, but her eyes were sharp. How curious! And did anyone else inquire about his medication? Mr. Gibbs shook his head. Not that I recall, Miss Marple, though Miss Trent did pop in last week, asking about headache powders. Seemed out of sorts, she did. Miss Marple thanked him and moved on to the tea shop, where the village's pulse beat strongest. There, amidst the clink of teacups, she overheard Mrs. Carter, the baker's wife, recounting a tale to a cluster of eager listeners. I saw that Miss Trent myself, 2 nights before the tragedy, Mrs. Carter declared. Skulking by the Grange's back gate, she was in a dark cloak. Denied it when I asked, but I know what I saw. Another voice, that of young Miss Polly from the haberdashery, chimed in. And Clara Hawthorne was at the Grange last week, arguing with her uncle. My cousin Tom, he's the gardener there, heard her shouting about that artist she fancies. Mr. Hawthorne wouldn't hear of it, said she'd lose her inheritance if she married him. Miss Marple sipped her tea, her expression serene but her mind racing. Clara's inheritance tied to her uncle's approval, Miss Trent's mysterious presence, and Mr. Price's financial disputes, which Mrs. Green had mentioned in passing, all were threads in a tangled skein. She recalled a case from her youth, where a young woman's defiance had led to a desperate act. Love and money, she murmured to herself, are such dangerous companions. Returning to her cottage, Miss Marple sought out Ellen, the Granger's maid, who had agreed to stop by on her half-day off. Ellen was a slight girl, her brown eyes wide with nervousness as she perched on the edge of a chair. "It's awful, Miss Marple," she said, twisting her hands. "Mr. Hawthorne was ever so kind. I can't think who'd hurt him." "Of course, my dear," Miss Marple said soothingly. "But you must have seen things at the Grange, being there every day. Did Mr. Hawthorne seem worried lately? Or did his guests leave any impressions?" Ellen bit her lip. "He was quieter than usual after those guests left. Miss Clara, she was all smiles, but I heard her crying in her room one night. Mr. Price was cross, slammed a door when he left, and Miss Trent, she hesitated, glancing at the floor. "Go on, Ellen," Miss Marple encouraged, her voice soft as a lullaby. "Well, she was odd," Ellen said. "Kept asking about Mr. Hawthorne's habits, what time he took his pills, when he played his gramophone. Said it was for a surprise, but it felt queer." Miss Marple's needles resumed their clicking, a steady rhythm against the silence. "A surprise," she repeated. "How thoughtful of her." She thought of a neighbour, Miss Langley, who had once asked similar questions about a rival's routine, only to sabotage her garden. Curiosity, she knew, could mask darker intentions. As Ellen left, Miss Marple reflected on the gramophone's role. Its music, playing at the moment of discovery, suggested a deliberate act, perhaps to fix the time of death or to mask some other sound. She recalled Mrs. Dobbs's mention of hearing it late, past 10, yet the record's 30-minute duration meant it was restarted closer to 7. Someone, she reasoned, had been in that room, setting the stage. Her next visitor was Tom, the gardener, a lanky youth with a sunburned face and a hesitant manner. He stood awkwardly in her parlour, cap in hand. "Mrs. Green said you wanted a word, miss," he mumbled. "I don't know much, but I'll tell what I can." "You're very kind, Tom," Miss Marple said, offering him a biscuit. "I hear you overheard Miss Clara arguing with her uncle. Could you tell me more?" Tom shifted uncomfortably. "It was last week, miss, when she was staying. I was pruning the roses near the library window. Miss Clara was saying she loved her artist, Peter Vane, and Mr. Hawthorne said he'd cut her off if she married him. She was proper upset, called him cruel and stormed out." "And the others?" Miss Marple prompted. "Mr. Price? Miss Trent?" "Mr. Price was angry too," Tom said. "I heard him in the hall one night, muttering about a deal that cost him dear. Said Mr. Hawthorne had cheated him. Miss Trent, she was quieter, but she asked me odd things like where the spare keys to the house were kept. Said she might visit again soon." Miss Marple's eyes gleamed. "Spare keys," she said softly. "How very interesting." She thought of a burglary in her old village, where a key left carelessly in a shed had unlocked a crime. "Thank you, Tom. You've been most helpful." As evening fell, Miss Marple sat by her fire, her cat Tuppence purring softly. She opened her notebook, adding new notes, Clara's defiance, Price's grudge, Trent's probing questions. The staff, too, warranted scrutiny, Mrs. Dobbs's trembling hands, Ellen's unease, Tom's observations. The gramophone, with its red smudge and timely music, remained the centrepiece, a silent witness to a calculated act. She leaned back, her mind drifting to a long-ago case where a ticking clock had misled everyone about a murder's timing. "It's all about timing," she told Tuppence. "The gramophone was meant to deceive, but it will betray its master." Tomorrow, she resolved, she would press Ellen further about Miss Trent's inquiries and revisit the Grange to examine the key situation. In Chipping Norton's quiet lanes, secrets were stirring, and Miss Marple, with her gentle persistence, was determined to bring them to light. Chapter 6. The Lipstick Clue. The morning dawned grey and damp over Chipping Norton, with a fine drizzle cloaking the village in a soft haze. Miss Jane Marple, undeterred by the weather, adjusted her scarf and set out for the Grange. Her mind fixed on the crimson smudge that marred the gramophone's brass horn. It was a detail that seemed both trivial and vital, like a single wrong note in a familiar tune. Her years of observing human nature had taught her that such discrepancies often pointed to the heart of a mystery, and she was determined to unravel this one. Inspector Craddock was already at the Grange when she arrived, his notebook open and his brow furrowed. "Good morning, Miss Marple," he said, his voice tinged with frustration. "The laboratory results are in. The brandy glass contained traces of digitalis, far more than a therapeutic dose. The pills themselves were clean, which means the poison was added directly to the drink." Miss Marple's eyes widened slightly, though her expression remained composed. "Digitalis in the brandy," she murmured. "How precise! Someone knew exactly what they were doing, didn't they?" Craddock nodded. "It's a clever job. No signs of a struggle, doors locked, and that gramophone playing to muddy the timeline. But we're still no closer to pinning down who did it." Miss Marple tilted her head, her gaze drifting to the drawing room, where the gramophone stood silent. "Perhaps," she said softly, "we should consider what the gramophone saw. That red smudge, for instance. It's rather insistent, don't you think?" They entered the drawing room, where the air felt heavy with the memory of tragedy. The armchair was empty now, but the brandy glass and pill bottle remained on the table, carefully preserved for evidence. Miss Marple approached the gramophone, her small figure moving with deliberate care. The crimson smudge was still there, a stark contrast against the polished brass. She leaned closer, her spectacles catching the light. "It's certainly lipstick," she said, "not a common shade either. Bold, almost theatrical." Craddock rubbed his chin. "We've asked everyone again. Mrs. Dobbs swears she never uses such things, and Ellen claims she only borrows a bit of powder now and then. Clara says her lipstick is a pale rose, and Miss Trent insists she hasn't touched makeup since her stage days ended." Miss Marple's lips curved into a faint smile. "Insists," she repeated, her tone thoughtful. "People do insist on things, don't they? But objects, Inspector, are less prone to falsehoods." She recalled a case from her youth, where a smudge of rouge on a teacup had betrayed a liar. "Might I speak with Ellen again? She's a nervous girl, but observant in her way." Craddock sent for Ellen, who appeared promptly, her apron starched but her hands fidgeting. "Yes, ma'am?" she said, her voice barely above a whisper, as she stood before Miss Marple. "My dear," Miss Marple began, her tone as soothing as a lullaby. "You mentioned borrowing Miss Trent's makeup case during her visit last week. Could you tell me more about that?" Ellen's cheeks flushed, and she glanced at Craddock before answering. "It was just a bit of fun, ma'am. Miss Trent left her old case in the guest room, and I tried some of her things. Just the powder and a bit of rouge. I didn't mean any harm." "Of course not," Miss Marple said kindly. And did you try her lipstick, perhaps? A bright red one. Ellen's eyes widened, and she shook her head vigorously. No, ma'am, I swear I didn't. There wasn't any lipstick in the case, just powder and rouge. I'd never touch the gramophone either. Mr. Hawthorne was particular about it. Miss Marple nodded, her expression encouraging. You're doing very well, Ellen. Now think carefully. Did you see anyone else near the gramophone that week? Or perhaps notice anything unusual about Miss Trent's things? Ellen hesitated, her fingers twisting the edge of her apron. Well, Miss Trent was in the drawing room a lot during her stay. She'd sit with Mr. Hawthorne, listening to his records. Once, I saw her win the gramophone herself, but I thought she was just helping him. Her case, though, it was old, like something from her acting days. I didn't see any lipstick, but there was a little mirror inside, cracked at the corner. Miss Marple's eyes gleamed. A cracked mirror, she said softly. How interesting. Thank you, Ellen. You've been most helpful. As Ellen scurried away, Craddock looked puzzled. A mirror? What does that tell us? Miss Marple adjusted her shawl, her mind racing. It tells us, Inspector, that Miss Trent may not be as far removed from her stage days as she claims. A cracked mirror suggests carelessness, or perhaps a life not quite left behind. She thought of a theatrical friend, Miss Barrow, who had clung to her old costumes long after retiring, as if unable to let go of the spotlight. We should look into Miss Trent's movements more closely, don't you think? Craddock agreed, promising to check Miss Trent's alibi for the night before the murder. Miss Marple, meanwhile, turned her thoughts to the timing of the crime. The gramophone's 30-minute record, still playing at 7 when Mrs. Dobbs found the body, suggested Mr. Hawthorne died shortly before. Yet Mrs. Dobbs had heard music late the previous night, around 10. Someone reset the gramophone, Miss Marple said, almost to herself, to make the death seem recent, or to cover their presence. She glanced at the brandy glass, its amber contents long since dried. The digitalis was in the brandy, not the pills, she mused. Someone who knew his habits, his evening drink, his love of music, chose their moment carefully. She recalled a village scandal where a poisoned glass of sherry had gone unnoticed because it was poured during a noisy party. The gramophone, she added, was not just a distraction. It was a clock ticking down to discovery. As they left the drawing room, Miss Marple paused by the hall table where a vase of wilted roses stood. Flowers fade so quickly, she remarked, though her mind was elsewhere. The lipstick smudge, Ellen's borrowed makeup, Miss Trent's questions about keys and habits, all pointed to a calculated act. Clara's defiance and Price's grudges could not be dismissed, but Miss Trent's shadowed past loomed larger now. Back at her cottage, Miss Marple lit a lamp and opened her notebook, adding the day's findings, the poisoned brandy, the clean pills, the theatrical lipstick. It's like a performance, she told her cat Tuppence, who blinked lazily from the hearth. And every performance has its star. Tomorrow she would press Miss Trent herself, perhaps over tea at the vicarage. The truth, she felt, was close, hidden in the flourish of a crimson smudge and the echo of a Schubert sonata. Chapter 7. The Trap is Set. The evening air in Chipping Norton was thick with the scent of damp earth and wood smoke, as Miss Jane Marple sat in her cottage, her knitting needles moving with a steady rhythm that belied the whirl of her thoughts. The fire cast a warm glow across the room, and Tuppence, her cat, dozed contentedly on the hearth. The clues in Mr. Hawthorne's death, the poisoned brandy, the gramophone's timely music, the crimson smudge, had begun to form a pattern in her mind, like a melody resolving into its final chords. Yet one piece remained elusive, and Miss Marple knew that to uncover it, she must draw the murderer out. She had spent the afternoon at the vicarage, where Mrs. Clement, ever eager to assist, had agreed to host a small gathering. "It's only right," Mrs. Clement had said, "to bring those involved together, to honour Mr. Hawthorne's memory." Miss Marple had nodded, her eyes twinkling with a purpose she did not share. The gathering, she felt, would be more than a memorial. It would be a stage, and she intended to direct the final act. Inspector Craddock called at her cottage just as the church clock struck 6, his face a mixture of curiosity and trust. "I've arranged it, Miss Marple," he said, settling into a chair. "Clara Hawthorne, Mr. Price, Miss Trent, and the Grange staff, Mrs. Dobbs, Ellen, and Tom, will all be at the vicarage tonight. I've told them it's to discuss the investigation's progress, but I sense you've something else in mind." Miss Marple's needles paused, and she gave him a serene smile. "You're very perceptive, Inspector. I believe our murderer is someone who knew Mr. Hawthorne's habits intimately, his brandy, his music, the hour he retired. The gramophone was set to play at a precise moment to mislead us about the time of death, but such precision requires familiarity, and familiarity breeds carelessness." Craddock leaned forward, his notebook untouched. "You think the lipstick smudge is the key?" "It is a clue," Miss Marple said, "but not the whole story. It points to someone who was in that room, perhaps adjusting the gramophone to cover their actions. Tonight, we shall see how our suspects react when the music plays again." The vicarage drawing room was a cosy contrast to the grandeur of the Grange, its walls lined with books and its air warmed by a crackling fire. Mrs. Clement bustled about, offering tea and scones, while the guests arrived with varying degrees of unease. Clara Hawthorne, her auburn hair pinned neatly, sat with a forced brightness, her eyes darting nervously. Mr. Leonard Price, his suit impeccable but his expression dour, stood by the window staring into the dark. Miss Sylvia Trent, elegant in a velvet dress, carried herself with the poise of her stage days, though her hands betrayed a slight tremor. Mrs. Dobbs, Ellen, and Tom hovered near the door, their faces a study in discomfort. Miss Marple, seated unobtrusively in a corner, observed them all, her knitting a soft counterpoint to the room's tension. She noted Clara's quick glances at the door, as if expecting her artist lover, Peter Vane. Price's fingers drummed impatiently, a sign of suppressed anger. Miss Trent's smile was too polished, like an actress awaiting her cue. The staff, meanwhile, seemed eager to blend into the wallpaper. Inspector Craddock stood, addressing the group with calm authority. "Thank you for coming," he began. "We're making progress in Mr. Hawthorne's case, and we thought it fitting to share some findings. The poison, digitalis, was in his brandy, not his pills, and the gramophone's music suggests a deliberate attempt to obscure the time of death." A murmur rippled through the room. Clara's hand flew to her mouth, Price's jaw tightened, and Miss Trent's eyes narrowed imperceptibly. Miss Marple, her needles clicking, watched them closely. "With Mrs. Clement's permission," she said, her voice gentle but clear, I thought we might play Mr. Hawthorne's favourite Schubert sonata tonight, as a tribute. It was, after all, the last music he heard." Mrs. Clement, slightly puzzled, agreed, and Craddock produced the record, borrowed from the Grange. He placed it on the vicarage's modest gramophone, a simpler model than Mr. Hawthorne's, and wound the crank. As the haunting strains of Schubert filled the room, Miss Marple's eyes never left the guests. Clara fidgeted, her fingers twisting a handkerchief. Price stared at the floor, his lips pressed thin. But it was Miss Trent who caught Miss Marple's attention. Her hands, clasped tightly, trembled more noticeably now, and her gaze flickered to the gramophone with a fleeting look of alarm. "Music," Miss Marple said softly, as if to herself, "has a way of stirring memories, doesn't it? I recall a young actress I knew who used music to mask her nerves before a performance. She'd hum a tune to steady herself, but her hands always gave her away." Miss Trent's head snapped up, her composure faltering. "What are you implying, Miss Marple?" she asked, her voice sharp. "Oh, nothing specific," Miss Marple replied, her tone mild. "Only that Mr. Hawthorne's gramophone played a role in his death, and someone touched it. Someone who left a trace of crimson lipstick. A shade, I'm told, that was popular in the theatre years ago." The room grew still, the music swelling to fill the silence. Clara's eyes widened, Price shifted uncomfortably, and Mrs. Dobbs gasped softly. Miss Trent's face paled, her poise crumbling like a poorly rehearsed line. "I told you," she said, her voice rising, "I haven't worn makeup in years." Miss Marple's needles paused, and she looked directly at Miss Trent. "My dear," she said gently, "you loved him once, didn't you? But he broke your heart all those years ago when he ended your engagement. When you visited last week, those old wounds reopened and you couldn't bear it." Miss Trent's hands flew to her face and a sob escaped her. "It wasn't meant to kill him," she cried. "I only wanted to scare him, to make him feel the pain he caused me. I slipped a little digitalis into his brandy, just enough to make him ill. I didn't know it would be too much." The room erupted in gasps. Craddock stepped forward, his voice calm but firm. "Miss Trent, you'll need to come with us." As Miss Trent was led away, her head bowed, Miss Marple resumed her knitting, her expression serene. "Love," she murmured to Mrs. Clement, who stood stunned nearby, "is such a dangerous motive." Later, as the vicarage emptied, Craddock turned to Miss Marple. "How did you know it was her?" "The gramophone," she said simply. "It was set to play at the right moment, by someone who knew his habits and his heart. The lipstick was her mistake, a relic of her past she couldn't quite leave behind." As she walked home through the quiet village, Miss Marple felt the weight of the truth settle. The trap had been set, and the music had played its part, revealing a killer's heart in its final notes. Chapter 8. The quiet restored. The soft glow of dawn crept over Chipping Norton, bathing the village in a gentle light that smoothed the edges of its stone walls and thatched roofs. Miss Jane Marple sat in her cottage, her knitting needles clicking softly as she worked on her shawl, now nearly complete. The fire in the hearth had dwindled to embers, and Tuppence, her cat, lay curled in a contented ball, oblivious to the storm of secrets that had broken the previous evening. The confession of Miss Sylvia Trent had rippled through the village like a stone cast into a still pond. And now, with the truth laid bare, a fragile calm was returning. Miss Marple's thoughts lingered on the scene at the vicarage, where the strains of Schubert had unravelled a murderer's composure. Miss Trent's admission that she had slipped digitalis into Mr. Hawthorne's brandy, intending only to frighten him but misjudging the dose, had been a shock to all but Miss Marple, whose quiet observation had long suspected the weight of old grievances. The gramophone, with its carefully timed music, had been Miss Trent's attempt to mask the moment of her crime, suggesting Mr. Hawthorne died later than he had. The crimson lipstick smudge, a remnant of her theatrical past, had betrayed her, clinging to the gramophone's horn like a ghost of her former self. Inspector Craddock visited her cottage that morning, his face a mixture of relief and admiration. "You've done it again, Miss Marple," he said, settling into a chair with a cup of tea she offered. Miss Trent's confessed everything, how she visited the Grange the night before, using a spare key she'd learned about during her stay. She waited until Mr. Hawthorne was alone, poured the digitalis into his brandy, and started the gramophone to cover her departure. She thought it would make the death seem natural, or at least later than it was. Miss Marple nodded, her eyes fixed on her knitting. "Poor woman," she said softly. "Love and betrayal can twist the heart so terribly. She carried that pain for years, and when she saw Mr. Hawthorne again, it was too much to bear." Craddock sipped his tea, his brow furrowed. "But how did you know it was her? The lipstick, yes, but there was more to it, wasn't there?" Miss Marple's lips curved into a faint smile. "It was the gramophone, Inspector. It was too deliberate, too perfectly timed. Only someone who knew Mr. Hawthorne's habits, his evening brandy, his love for that Schubert sonata, could have planned it so neatly." And Miss Trent, with her questions about his routine and her theatrical flair, fit the part. The lipstick was merely the curtain rising on her performance. She set her needles aside, her gaze drifting to the window where the village stirred quietly. "I thought of a young woman I knew once, in another village, who used a loud radio to hide her tears during a quarrel. Music, you see, can conceal so much. Footsteps, a door closing, a heart breaking." Craddock shook his head, a wry smile forming. "You make it sound so simple, Miss Marple. Clara was a suspect, with her inheritance at stake, and Price had his financial grudges. Even the staff seemed nervous enough to hide something. How do you always see through it?" "People are not so different, Inspector," she replied, her voice gentle. "Whether in Chipping Norton or elsewhere, they act from the same impulses: love, greed, fear, revenge. Miss Trent's pain was old, but it burned fiercely. I saw it in her hands trembling as the music played last night. Hands, you know, tell such truths." Craddock rose, his notebook tucked away. "Well, the village owes you a debt, as usual. Clara's shaken but relieved. She's free to marry her artist now, though she'll have to sort out the will. Price is grumbling about his losses, but he's cleared. The staff are back to their duties, though Mrs. Dobbs says she'll never look at a gramophone the same way." Miss Marple smiled, adjusting her shawl. "They never do, once a secret's been played out." As Craddock left, promising to keep her informed of Miss Trent's trial, Miss Marple took up her knitting again. The village was settling back into its rhythm, the butcher calling out his wares, children laughing in the lane, the church clock chiming the hour. Yet she knew that beneath this calm, other secrets waited, small and silent, like seeds beneath the soil. She thought of Miss Trent, whose life had been shaped by a broken promise and a moment of reckless vengeance. It reminded her of a neighbour, Mrs. Harrow, who had once destroyed a Guiteau rival's prized roses in a fit of jealousy. "We all have our moments of weakness," Miss Marple murmured to Tuppence, "but some leave deeper scars." Later that day she strolled to the churchyard, where the vicar, Mr. Clement, was tending his roses. He greeted her warmly, his face still shadowed by the week's events. "A sad business, Miss Marple," he said. "I never imagined Miss Trent capable of such a thing. She seemed so poised." "Poise, Mr. Clement," Miss Marple said, "is often a mask. Like a well-tended garden, it hides the weeds beneath." She paused, her eyes softening. "But gardens can be mended, and so can villages. Chipping Norton will heal in time." As she returned home, the sun broke through the clouds, casting a warm light over the village. Miss Marple paused at her gate, her gaze sweeping the familiar lanes. The Grange, with its silent gramophone, would stand empty for a while, its story now part of Chipping Norton's quiet history. But Miss Marple, with her sharp eyes and gentle heart, would continue to watch, ready for the next thread to tug at her curiosity. She entered her cottage, lit the lamp, and settled by the fire, her knitting resuming its steady rhythm. The world outside might hum with secrets, but within these walls all was calm. "Another stitch completed," she told Tuppence, her smile serene. "And the pattern, as always, holds true.